Hello, my name is Doug Dortch, minister at Captiva Chapel by the Sea. Thank you for joining me today as we consider a brief message on what it takes to stand securely in the presence of God. A message that I hope will bring you some encouragement for your day. It's an old story, but it's a telling one. Once upon a time at a religious retreat, a participant was going through the cafeteria line when he came across a bowl of apples. And next to the apples was a handmade sign that read, "Take only one apple, God is watching you." But then at the end of the cafeteria line where the desserts were, there was a plate of cookies and also another homemade sign that someone had obviously scrawled, and that sign read, "Take as many cookies as you want, God is back watching the apples." Well, as corny as the story sounds, it does make an important point, which is that few people go through life aware of God's abiding presence, and as a result, they are unsure about whether they can even claim God's abiding presence. Which raises the question, so how do we become more mindful that God is always with us? And just as importantly, how do we desire it? Now, those are questions that are certainly on the psalmist's mind as we look at the 24th Psalm. Now, you may not be as familiar with Psalm 24 as you are with its neighbor, Psalm 23, but I find it providential that both of these Psalms, Psalm 23 and Psalm 24, are right next to each other. Psalm 23, of course, speaks to us of a God who draws near to guide us and to direct us, to provide for us, and to protect us, a God who carries us through the valley of the shadow of death so that we might dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But the 24th Psalm is one that really ought to be read in tandem with Psalm 23 because, having shown us in Psalm 23 why we should embrace God's abiding presence, Psalm 24 invites us to do what is necessary to prepare ourselves on how we embrace that presence. Look at the first verse in Psalm 24. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? And then, according to the psalmist, the answer to that question is the one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in idols or swear by a false god, and by being open to receiving the blessing and vindication that comes to us from a God who is indeed rich in mercy and grace. In other words, to stand in the presence of God always requires us to pay close attention to both the external and the internal. Clean hands and pure hearts, which are two sides of the same coin of salvation, and both are necessary for us to know God's peaceful presence in every moment of life. One of my favorite stories in the Gospels that I think speaks to this point is that story in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John where Jesus encounters a woman who has been caught in the very act of adultery. Actually, Jesus didn't invite the encounter. The woman was dragged before him by the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees. You remember the story. "Teacher," they say to Jesus, "we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" And you can surely see that their question was a trap. They weren't concerned about the law. They certainly weren't concerned about the woman. They were concerned about the threat that Jesus posed to their system of presumption and merit. And so they were looking for a way to get Jesus to incriminate himself. And what does Jesus do? First, it seems that Jesus doesn't do anything at all. He bends down and writes on the ground with his finger. Some say he was stalling for time. Others say he was writing out the sins of the scribes and the Pharisees. Who knows? That's all speculation. But what matters most in the story are two things. Things that point to Jesus' emphasis on the need that each of us has to have clean hands and a pure heart. First is the response that Jesus gives to the religious authorities. Whoever among you who is without sin, let him cast the first stone, which of course none of them was willing to do because none of them was clean enough or pure enough to do it. And then when all of the woman's accusers dropped their stones and began to crawl away, Jesus was left alone with the woman. And turning to that unquestionably guilty soul, Jesus asked her what must have struck her as a terrifying question. Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you? And her response was in all likelihood a mix of relief and trepidation because her accusers had disappeared. And yet she still stood before a man who had the cleanest hands and the purest heart that anyone could ever find. And so the jury was still out until the verdict came down from the judge of all mankind. As Jesus said, then neither do I condemn you, but go your way and sin no more. This adulterous woman had received from Jesus both blessing and vindication, but also a mandate to move on from that moment an eternally changed soul. Go your way and sin no more. You see, the thing about God's abiding presence is that every moment becomes an opportunity to trust our way to God so that in Jesus we might ever be experiencing the change that Jesus brings about, so that day by day we become more and more the person that God created us to be. How was it that Martin Luther King Jr. once phrased it? I may not be the man I want to be, and I may not be the man I ought to be, and I may not be the man I could be, but praise God, I'm not the man I used to be. Only Jesus can make such a change possible as he brings to bear God's abiding presence in our lives. So grow in his grace and his knowledge today, so that in the coming days your hands will be cleaner and your heart will be purer and your faith will be more genuine. And then when the time comes that you feel most alone or most unworthy, you'll know better. You'll know that God's presence is always available with every measure of mercy and grace, so that you can embrace all of it and go your way to sin no more. Thank you for listening today. I hope you have a great week, and I'll look forward to seeing you next Sunday.